planning and especially statewide level planning. So it's not designed in any way to supplant the planning that is occurring for very specific projects throughout the state, all the work that local water providers are doing. And it's not intended to be used in a court of law in any way, shape, or form. So we have been working very closely with the Attorney General's office on the study, on this disclaimer language, of course, and especially on where we go with things from here. So one of the big asks that we'll talk about later today is what we do with all of this information. And spoiler alert, but the goal is to really hand this off to the roundtables to then update the basin implementation plans. And that could very well involve modeling of specific projects to really look at kind of regionally how did the different, what we called IPPs in the past, the identified projects and processes, how those could be impacted and consequently impact each other if they're vying for the same water, things like that. So we need to be careful as we move forward with all those different pieces. And of course, also recognize that this is in no way a compact compliance study. This is not a risk analysis study. So we do have material in the study. It's actually section 3 of the report. We only have 5 sections. Section 3 really dives into trying to compare how this is different with what we've done before and really explaining kind of the value in this new methodology moving forward. So we will get into some of that today. Just wanted to show a quick graphic from the report itself. And then again, we do have the basin results and statewide results in section 4 of the study. For those that are interested, if you want to choose to tune out of this long presentation, like I said, the study is posted on the Water Plan website. So if you do want to, for example, follow along and download things, it's all up there right now. And again, just showing, what things look like. This happens to be the Arkansas Basin because we're in the Arkansas Basin right now, but just how we're reporting results. We actually went through and color-coded each of the basins. So as we've mentioned many times before, we have chosen to drop the beloved SWASI acronym, the Statewide Water Supply Initiative. It was confusing for many years because it actually was following up on the heels of a tool that had predated it called the Surface Water Supply Index. I think a lot of roundtables certainly grew to know and maybe love that term, that acronym, but in light of all the work that's occurred on the water plan, we wanted to make sure that everything really made sense. So the 3 main pieces of all the work that we do with the roundtables, with the board, with the IBCC, really is all part of the water plan. And so to that end, we are really running with that and rebranding this as the technical update, the analysis and technical update to the water plan. We'll move into the basin update phase next, and then subsequently into the comprehensive update phase. So we'll talk a little bit more about that process and the timing at the end of the day for our very last item. We also wanted to stress that we've had some discussions over the years about kind of how we progress with the study, what the timing is, what the deadlines might be, but we have been on time throughout the process. So this is table 11-1 taken directly from the water plan, chapter 11 of the water plan, that said that we would initiate the statewide water supply initiative, which it was called at the time, in the year 2016, which we did. We kicked off the process, had robust outreach, with the process that I'll talk about, and now we're wrapping up the study here in 2019. And then consequently, in the basin implementation plans, we did actually kick off in 2018. We've had this robust discussion with the roundtables and what we called our implementation working group to start getting feedback on what that process will look like. And we'll more formally really launch into that, of course, with all of this data at our statewide roundtable summit. We're calling it the Colorado 9 Basin Roundtables, the C9 Summit, in September of this year. So we're really excited to move that process forward and then dive right into updating the water plan itself. So to speak to the outreach, of course, we had all the comments from the water plan, over 30,000 public comments, and 4 targeted outreach efforts, along with technical webinars, and 6 implementation working group meetings that I had mentioned with the roundtable members, as well as these technical advisory groups. So a lot of the work that we did initially was really setting the stage for how we were going to do this because it's so different than anything we've done before. We had to really sit down and look at the data that we had, look at how we could run the numbers, look at what it really meant to even quantify the scenarios that we were given from the water plan itself. And then we certainly did multiple round trips with the roundtables. It's been on every agenda to at least mention updates, but more specific presentations as well. And we will certainly be following up and doing that more, starting with the C9 Summit to really package everything for that day. just screenshots here showing what the website does look like now with this live. The image on the bottom there is the FTP site. So we are using the water plan website as opposed to the main CWCB website. Long story, we are actually updating both of those, in particular the CWCB website, which is very much in need of that. Logistically, it was easier to post on the water plan website. And then we do have links to the data itself, which is in an FTP site, which is that image you see at the bottom. So it's in nested folders. If you're familiar with how those work, it's just like a kind of a file management system. So the main objectives of the study are simply to recharacterize our water supply issues, our water supply gaps, to run the numbers, look at where we have needs, and then we will then pivot to the roundtables to really work on plugging in projects strategically to meet those needs. In addition, for the first time, we're excited to really look in much more depth at potential environmental and recreational flow needs through the creation of a flow tool, which basically takes the output from all the modeling that we did at the monthly time step with all of the different scenarios that we have. And then we have a handful of other user-friendly standardized tools and data products that are all part of this whole process that we'll speak to later as well, that we really hope will help inform roundtables as they then go forth and update their basin plans.
Okay. This is Matt Lindberg. I'm with Brown and Caldwell. As Greg mentioned, I've been the project manager for this update, and wanted to start out and talk a little bit about some of the creative thinking that needed to go into our approach. So we looked at gaps and supplies and demands under the context of the 5 planning scenarios that are in Colorado's water plan. And if you look at those scenarios, they're really a story of what we could expect in the future. And so one of the challenges was to take that story and turn that narrative into numbers, something that we can quantify for the purposes of the technical update. And so that took some creative thinking. And we put together these 4 technical advisory groups, or tags, and they focused on the topics that are on the screen. And for those in the gallery there, it's environmental and recreation, agricultural demands, municipal and industrial demands, and planning scenarios. And so those technical advisory groups were made up of people from across the state, from roundtables, other subject matter experts, and we worked with them on our methodologies. Importantly, we worked with them on our assumptions, and it was a very valuable exercise to, and it helped us improve our approaches. And so I'll go through some of the new features of the technical update and maybe contrast some of that which was done in SWASI 2010. So on the diagram on the screen there, you see on the left an illustration of our previous method. And it was really standard practice at the time. You look at your current conditions, you project out to some future year, 2050. You look at what your most likely scenario of supplies, demands, gaps, what that might be. And then you add some sensitivity to that. You take a few drivers, you add a positive and negative percentage maybe to develop a high, medium, and low future look. Scenario planning and adaptive management takes a more comprehensive approach, and it's illustrated with that diagram on the right, which we call the cone of uncertainty. And on the left, we have our current conditions, and we project out to what we might expect in the year 2050, but we really describe that as 5 plausible future scenarios that are impacted by a whole variety of different drivers. And we model those future scenarios, and then we're able to put together portfolios of projects that are going to meet our needs in those future scenarios. And then we can set up a monitoring program to look at those drivers. Those drivers all have uncertainty. They may be pointing us in the direction of one scenario or another, or as a combination of scenarios. But you can take your portfolio of projects, and as you monitor conditions through time, you can adaptively apply projects that are the most appropriate. So it's a more comprehensive method and something that was laid out in Colorado's water plan. So I'll say a few words about these different scenarios. They're spelled out in the water plan. I'll give you the 2-sentence highlight of each one of them. Business as usual. assumes that our current trends continue into the future with respect to water demands, with respect to our climate. So our climate doesn't really see any significant changes. Rates of development and population growth are similar to what we've seen in the past. Weak economy, on the other hand, assumes that the world's economy slows and that we don't have as much water development and that our population doesn't increase as fast as we've projected. And it really puts the least amount of stress on our water resources of the 5 scenarios. Oh, and importantly, we assume in the weak economy scenario that there is no change in our future climate. Cooperative growth assumes that we're going to have similar population increases that we've seen in the past, and that is projected by the State Demography Office, but it's going to be focused in urban areas and in mountain communities. We're going to see moderate warming of the climate, and that will drive our demands up, but we will also incorporate conservation measures to help offset those increased demands. Adaptive innovation assumes a hot and dry future and a lot of population growth, and to offset that, aggressive conservation. And then hot growth assumes likewise a hot and dry future, a lot of population growth, and not much focus on conservation. So it really taxes our water supplies the most of all of the scenarios. So I mentioned climate change and how that is incorporated into those different scenarios. That's a new feature of the technical update, and it's incorporated in the different scenarios as was shown there on the slide. In order to really evaluate those 5 planning scenarios and incorporate the complexity of climate change, we've really leaned on the state's investment in Colorado's decision support systems and the data and models associated with that. It's been, we were very fortunate to have those, and they were really key in helping us to do the kinds of analyses we needed to do for the technical update. They weren't as extensively available in SWASI 10 in 2010, and so they weren't used then, but we really used them this time around. Another new feature is estimating an agricultural gap in parallel with municipal and industrial gaps. In SWASI 2010, we estimated field-based or crop-based shortages, but this time around, we're looking at diversion-based demands, which incorporate conveyance losses and efficiencies on the farm. And so as a result, the agricultural gap numbers are going to be higher than what was in SWASI 2010, but we're also accounting for those efficiency questions. And we're able to then plug those demands into the water allocation models that we're using to calculate the gaps. Another new feature is the use of municipal water demand reporting as a result of HB 1051. That's helped us to get a better handle on what current water uses look like and help us do better projections into the future. Our focus this time, and Greg alluded to this, that there are really 3 parts to our planning processes. There's the technical update, which really focuses on data and tools and analyses. There's basin implementation planning, which looks at portfolios of projects that used to be a part of SWASI 2010, but that's really at the Basin Roundtable level now. And then there was also policy discussions in SWASI 2010, but that's really the role of the water plan at this point. So our focus has been really exclusively on tools and data sets. So I'll talk a little bit about how we're looking at gaps. I have on the screen, you probably recognize, we called it the wedge diagram in the past, but it's how gaps were described in SWASI 2010. And you'll see bar charts and figures like the one on the screen in the technical update. And I'll use those to kind of compare and contrast how we're looking at the gaps. So in SWASI 2010, we only looked at municipal and industrial gaps. We're looking both at ag and municipal and industrial gaps this time around. In SWASI 2010, we looked at passive and active conservation separately, but the planning scenarios really describe active and passive conservation jointly, and so we're handling it jointly this time around. In SWASI 2010, we looked at low, medium, high gaps. We're looking at gaps under the 5 different planning scenarios. Importantly, in SWASI 2010, we incorporated consideration of the yields from identified projects and processes that water providers were pursuing to help fill the gap. That was a part of the gap calculation, and we're not doing that this time around. And there's several reasons for that. One, we don't have enough information on those projects, those future proposed projects, to really model them statewide in a uniform fashion. Also, the assumptions that we make in the various scenarios may not be the same assumptions that water providers have made in developing their IPNPs, and so that could potentially be problematic for projects that are in a permitting process if we come out with different answers on yields than they would come out with in their permitting. So there were several reasons that we didn't look at that at this point, but that is something that Basin Roundtables will do in their Basin Implementation Plan updates. And so finally, the way we're generally describing gaps in the technical update for municipal purposes, we're looking at and generally reporting maximum gaps that occur for municipal and industrial users, which is sort of in parallel with how municipalities plan. They plan for worst case scenarios or severe drought conditions. That said, the report has average gap information. The data sets we develop and other in our reports have time series of gaps, so we can look at gaps in a lot of different ways. But for general reporting in the technical update report, you'll see some focus on max M&I gaps. And then for agriculture, we've looked at it in several different ways. We're generally reporting average agricultural gaps. Ag lives with a gap and maybe has different water management objectives than cities do. So we've reported average ag gaps. We have maximum ag gaps in the report, so all that information is there. But we're looking at it in two different ways. One is the total gap, but one is also the incremental gap, and that's really the degree to which gaps may increase in the future. Ag, again, as I said, has a gap now. We anticipate maybe some Basin Roundtables would want to really focus in on how much worse could it get for ag and what can we do to prevent that. And so that's why we've presented the incremental gap as well. So with that, can maybe pause and see if there are any questions on some of these new features or the overall approach. Yeah. Maybe I'll just back up here to that slide. So ag currently has a gap, and that's shown there in that under that baseline bar on the left side of the bar chart that illustrates that existing ag gap. And so as we have, say, additional demands because of warmer temperatures or less precipitation. That's the dark green. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Really, hot growth in the cities versus ag, those two are completely decoupled, right? I mean, there's not really any correlation between what kind of growth you'd have in ag versus ag, right? Did you have like two completely different tracks?
There is some overlap there because if a city is growing, they're potentially urbanizing irrigated lands, and so that urbanization could decrease the overall ag demand. So there is some coupling, and that is a complication of these different scenarios is that a lot of drivers sort of overlap each other, and it's all sort of built together.
I'm from the West Slope, we don't have that problem.
Okay.
Good deal. Well, if there's no more questions, we'll certainly be getting into a lot of this detail so we can keep things moving for you. I'll hand things over to Becky Donovan, CDM Smith.
Hi. Yes, I'm Becky Donovan. I'm with CDM Smith. So we'll first talk about some of the tools we developed with. Our tasks involved developing 3 tools to help with the information that went into all of this. So today we'll talk about two of those tools that we updated or developed. We have made enhancements to the ENR database. Previously, it was referred to as the Non-Consumptive Needs Assessment, NCNA database. So a portion of our work was updating that database and then also developing an ENR flow tool that was mentioned earlier. So we'll walk through both of those and what went into that. So the environmental and recreational database update here really focused on three success factors. We were enhancing the technical foundation, providing a more engaging and meaningful user experience, and then developing a tool that can be integrated into this Colorado water planning process. With the updates from the environmental and rec database, we were able to use some of that information to build on other previous efforts. Some of you may remember the watershed flow evaluation tool that was previously developed. So building on that, we've created an environmental flow tool that really helps visualize the variations in these new flow scenarios under the different planning horizons. And it's also intended to help the Basin Roundtables really refine, categorize, and prioritize their ENR projects. So we'll start with the ENR database. We sort of list the tasks that were included in this effort, again, focusing on those three success factors. So we have updated the spatial reference. Previously, that NCNA database used USGS and HD data only. We've now married that with the Colorado Source Water Route Framework that's been used in the South Platte Basin. So where there wasn't complete coverage of the Source Water Route Framework, there's NHD data to back it up. So there is options to map and look at data by segment or by HUC based on preference. I know the roundtables had different preferences on that in the past. We have also developed loading templates, so Excel-based forms that are user-friendly. They're now available so that as the database continues to evolve, data can be collected and entered consistently, and there's clear guidance on what information is needed. We have updated the ENR attributes. Those of you that have participated in the NCNA focus area mapping previously will be familiar with these. You know, in this update, we sort of looked at what we had to work with. And going back and looking at it, there were 108, this graphic shows here, environmental and recreational attributes. And then those were collected, 10, 15 years ago. So in an effort to update that, we really went through and verified that the data were up to date and got more up-to-date data as needed. Consolidated, there were a lot of duplicates. There was a lot of attributes with names that were similar. So that effort brought us down to a new set of 58 environmental and recreational attributes within the database. We also did put some effort in to further categorize them into macro attribute categories. So it's easier to search for things you're looking for. We show some examples here: cold water fish, warm water fish, wetlands riparian, boating and stream flows. We also had intended to update and include project information from the last round of BIPs. When we actually got in there and looked at the data, we found it was really inconsistent. A lot of important information was lacking to include it in a spatial geodatabase moving forward. So that didn't happen. We've included the legacy project data from the SWASI 2010 initial projects and method database effort. So that information is still in there. And then again, with these loading templates that we've developed, we really are looking for future iterations to be able to include data and in a useful way with consistent data that will be usable by the basins. This last bullet here, we say we're making the data available and easily accessible. The GIS data have been transferred to CWCB to post on their web-based GIS data viewer, so people can access the data and look at it that way. 2 screens. So that's really the bulk of what we've done for the environmental database. So I think the takeaway there is that it's evolving, and the effort is really, we tried to set up a framework for a more comprehensive tool in the future. So as the implementation plans, the basin implementation plans are developed moving forward, we'll have better project data. The basins will have up-to-date attribute information. So it's an iterative process, but this update is getting us closer to a comprehensive tool for everyone to use. So with that, we'll change gears a little bit to this environmental flow tool, which we've developed. It was developed with the assistance of the Nature Conservancy. We're just showing sort of an overview of what's going on. We take the hydrologic data, the CDSS data, and then these projected flows for each planning scenario. We are using established flow ecology relationships, flow-based metrics and calculations for these macro attribute categories. Again, that was a portion of the watershed flow evaluation tool. The watershed flow evaluation tool really was basin specific. I think it got used in Colorado and the Yampa previously. This tool looks at all of this data and gives us statewide overview. So with that, it assesses risk to the ENR attributes at 54 pre-selected statewide nodes. It's really a tool that is going to supply the user with information on predicted flow changes and the resulting risk categories to macro attributes. I think it will help identify when and where there's potential issues in the future. As we started, I think every presentation today, what is it and what is it not? So really, again, it's a high-level tool. As we said, it builds on previous efforts. Oh, sorry. Builds on previous efforts, specifically the watershed flow evaluation tool. It post-processes DSS projections to provide summaries of changes in monthly flow at pre-selected locations under the different planning scenarios. It's identifying potential risks through flow ecology calculation projections. It serves as a complementary tool to the DSS. Again, it can help refine, categorize, and prioritize ENR projects. And it's useful, I think, it can provide some guidance during stream management planning and the development of the BIPs. So what it's not, again, it's a high-level tool. It's certainly not prescriptive. I got it. It's not designating any gap values. It's not providing the basis for any regulatory action. It does not identify areas where these ecological changes may be associated with factors other than stream flow. Stream flow is the driving force behind these calculations. It also does not provide results as detailed or accurate as site-specific analysis. We're giving a broad overview, estimated picture of what potential issues may be. So just to give a view of what the tool looks like, the top right-hand side of the map here is showing the nodes that are preloaded into this tool. The shading here is concentrations of those macro attribute categories that we took from the database. So we worked with TNC, CWCB, Wilson Water to then look at all the nodes in the DSS and say, where are these macro attribute categories concentrated? Where do we have some spatial coverage? And then based on that selection, is there a good period of record? Is there good data availability? So we ended up with these 54 nodes. The tool is Excel-based. It uses Visual Basic. It's user-friendly. The left side here shows the user interface. You can select a basin, a node. You select a simulation period. And then there is the option to select a reference condition, either naturalized, unimpacted by human activity, and then baseline, which is basically existing. And then future scenarios, we have all the planning scenarios that Greg and Matt just talked about. And then there's also isolated climate change to the naturalized condition. So you can select any of those. outputs are sort of listed here at the bottom. All of these time series plots, so you can look at flow changes alone, or there's this environmental flow table, which we're showing at the bottom. It's really color coded based on risk. Risk is defined by percent depletion from the historic reference condition. You can, like I said, you can select naturalized or baseline. Risk category changes based on the attribute category. There's also the option here, so it color codes from low to high risk. There's also the option to include the metric values. So if you include the metric values, this would show you what the percent departure from your reference condition was that went along with those color codings. So some general summary of findings from going through the tool and looking at the nodes and writing up some of the results. Climate change impacts on stream flows really drive the risks to the ENR attributes. Future stream hydrographs generally show earlier peaks, sometimes more extreme peaks, drier conditions in late summer. Earlier peak runoffs may create a mismatch for species needs. Drier late summer conditions potentially raise water temperatures and reduce habitat. This flow chart is just showing some of those things that we said. The bars to the left-hand side are the blue and orange are the naturalized and baseline conditions. And then those scenarios where hot and dry conditions are applied are to the right-hand side. And you can see the peak ramps up earlier in April. It occurs in May and drops off more steeply. In general, mountain streams with no infrastructure, so nodes that are sort of high up with no infrastructure, had lower moderate risks. Increasing risks to riparian plants and fish. Risks can increase as climate change factors increase. Mountain streams where infrastructure does exist had varying risks. Streams that are depleted for transfers and diversions could see increased risks from lower flows, while some streams, nodes that are downstream of reservoirs, those risks were not as great because the reservoir flows were minimizing those peaks. So also we looked at places with nodes with in-stream flow rights and boating diversion water rights. You know, certainly as the later season water is lower, they're met less often under those climate change scenarios. So it was sort of a lot to blow through, but if you have any questions, yeah.
Could you help me out, just walk through how, just pick one attribute and how do you develop the risk scenario? And I'm thinking, I don't know if this is an attribute, but thinking, for example, when we look at, the fish habitat, we're looking at channel flows, and those things usually require a lot of very site-specific evaluation. So I'm curious as to how do you evaluate risk based on very, very coarse kind of data.
A lot of the information had previously been established through the water flow evaluation tool work. We worked hand in hand with John Sanderson on a lot of this. In the report, there's a big matrix for each of these categories, what equations were applied and what risk factors were assigned and why. Off the top of my head, I can't dig back there, but it was a collaborative effort with John and TNC. I think they were based on sort of well-established, and that risk categories change. They're not predefined for every category. That 10% depletion for one thing may be low risk, but a 10% depletion for another category may fall in almost high risk. They changed by category too.
Maybe I'm just think. It's just, maybe I'm very slow, but I that's a black box to me. I really don't. And when I try to explain, well, there's how this is done, I can't. So maybe the question is, what can you advise to really understand this? Because to me, it's still a black box.
Sure. No, that's a great question, Melly. This is, I mean, for the sake of time today, we couldn't get into a lot of these details. But we, like Becky said, we have all of that documented. So it's in volume 2. And I mentioned we have a technical memo on all the details and how this was pulled together. So for each of those 7 attributes, we have very specific equations that, a lot of science went into, for many, many years that, culminated in the state of Colorado with the watershed flow evaluation tool. So a lot of those equations were really honed, to rivers in this state through that work. And then this particular effort then kind of took that one more step forward, but largely built on those same equations. And so we didn't want to get into the equations today, but it takes, the flow, it's all based on the monthly time step. It looks at things like, the ratio of late season flow versus early season flow, that are different for those different categories, those different species. And so we have a whole host of information we could get into on that, but we just, for any number of the things that we're trying to touch on today, it's a delicate dance in the appropriate level of detail for those. So I apologize. I understood it is kind of a black box because it's, the algorithms are running behind the scenes, but we do have all that very well documented.
Yeah, I'm just suggesting that if you're going to present this to other folks, maybe you may want to tweak it more into English because, again, I may be thick here, but it's hard to understand and it's hard to defend some of those numbers later on.
Sure. No, and we could easily spend an hour or two today just on the flow tool itself. So it's just hard to get into all of it. Any other questions? All right.
I have a question, I guess. How have your numbers changed as a result of utilizing climate change now as compared to previous iterations?
Good question, Director Gibbs. Absolutely. And we'll get into a lot more of the details when we get to the gaps that Carol will address. But, as Matt Lindbergh had touched on, with scenario planning, we took a very different approach with those different scenarios. We basically had 3 different looks at climate change, one of which was more of just a no climate change scenario, a baseline condition, and then 2 of which were looking at different climate change scenarios, being one in the middle and then one that's very hot and dry. So the one in particular that is much more hot and dry, so it's our hot growth scenario as well as our adaptive innovation scenario. It is very clearly depicted in the modeling for those and in the gap numbers, and those do result in different gaps. They basically balance out. Matt had mentioned, one of the issues with scenario planning is that it is not a sensitivity analysis. So you can't look at specific drivers and see how things change because they're all mixed up by design. But there's still a lot of good, valuable information in that will kind of get to some of those stories a little bit later, with Karen Bayorn especially. Okay. Hand it over to Karen Sobieski.
Hi. And I'm going to apologize right now to everybody behind me. I'm sorry. But we're gonna dive right in. So I'm a principal with Wilson Water Group, and as Greg mentioned, I've been working on the agricultural component. And it is the largest use of water in the state of Colorado. So it's something that, as Matt walked through, it was really exciting this go round for SWASI, or this technical update, to really dive into what those agricultural demands are and how they may change across planning scenarios. And most importantly, how they work, kind of with, or in a lot of basins compete for some of those water supplies with the M&I demands. So we're going to dive right into just the agricultural demand component of this effort for right now. In general, I know this is a I know many people in this room already know this, but as a quick high level, the agricultural diversion demand is the amount of water supply that needs to be diverted or pumped to meet the full crop water requirement. That's different than what the historical diversions are to meet agricultural demands. We really needed to get to how much water would you need to divert or pump to meet that field level demand, because that was the only way we could run what ifs analysis. If we changed some of those things in these planning scenarios, we changed the water supply, we changed what those demands might be. So we needed to make sure that we didn't get the shorted demand of what the crops have seen historically. We're trying to get to exactly, in a perfect world, what would they need at that head gate or that wellhead, knowing full well that agricultural users do not receive the full amount of water that they would like. So we took crop types, delineated acreage, and precip and temperature data to develop the irrigation water requirement. This is by parcel. We're fortunate in the state of Colorado to have irrigated acreage coverages that have this information and are also tied to source. So we take that irrigation water requirement. We then look at what the conveyance and application processes are for each of these, so that we can develop efficiencies. So we're thinking, in the graphic, we're looking at a sprinkler that's maybe pumping from well water, and that would be a much higher efficiency than if we were trying to divert that water in a long ditch to a flood irrigated field. So those efficiencies are important. So we take the IWR, we take some of these efficiencies, we divide that irrigation water requirement by those efficiencies to effectively back up that demand to the head gate, and that's how we're ending up with our agricultural demands. So the first step was really understanding where we're at now. So we currently need 13 million acre feet of diversions and pumping to meet 6.2 million acre feet of IWR on 3.3 million acres of irrigated land in the state of Colorado. The graphic reflects the breakdown by basin. Should come to no surprise, the largest producing, the basins with the most acreage are, generally requiring the most water to meet those demands. In the graphic, we're looking at that acreage number in the yellow bar, the average IWR in that green bar, and then the average demand, the amount of water that we need in that blue bar. The acreage and the IWR numbers for current levels match very closely to what SWASI 2010 had. We were really using a lot of the same information with only a few updates this go around for ag info. But again, that big change is that agricultural diversion demand. So there is no comparison to that in the SWASI 2010 because we're looking at it now for kind of the first time. So because we have a larger demand, as Matt mentioned, our gap is also going to be larger from an agricultural standpoint. So once we had that current estimate of agricultural demand, now we got to change it for planning scenarios, as Matt mentioned, taking that narrative to numbers. The narratives were this paragraph, and they looked at municipal and industrial and climate and ag. And so from those narratives, we were able to pull out what we thought were 5 drivers: this urbanization, planned agricultural projects, groundwater acreage sustainability, climate, and then emerging technologies. Because what we had to do is get drivers that matched components in the calculation that we could change. So we were able to tie that urbanization, that planned agricultural projects, and the groundwater acreage to adjusting the acreage. And then we looked at climate that we then hit against that irrigation water requirement, and emerging technologies were then adjusting that system efficiency. There's plenty of documentation. It's good bedtime reading, I'm not going to lie. But it all goes in depth, really, with what we did in each basin, because we really tried to look at the agricultural demands specific in each basin so that we could have a tailored adjustment that was applicable and useful to those basin roundtable members. I'm going to give some examples here. Again, we're not going to be able to hit on all of them because of the time. But we were looking at new farms and ranches in the Northwest. We have acreage that may potentially be put into production in the Yampa and the North Platte basins. We have on the eastern slope that we're converting flood to sprinkler or drip irrigation, and that's impacting that efficiency number. We're improving the efficiency on some of that land. Again, we have wide variability across Colorado. You guys can drive from Dinosaur to National Park to La Junta, and you'll see that ag is very different across the state. We were fortunate to be able to meet with stakeholders as well as our TAG to really understand what issues they're looking at from an ag perspective in many of the basins, particularly those with a lot of complex ag kind of issues. So we were also looking at removing acreage. Both because we have declining aquifer levels. I know Cleve mentioned earlier, how this, the Rio Grande is trying to look at that demand management. But we really were just trying to say, what does that ag picture look like by 2050? We also have declining aquifer levels that were in the Republican Basin that is impacting that future acreage. Then we also have this municipal growth. We have this urbanization. I think it's an inevitable factor that we've seen historically and will continue in the future, where we have that municipal growth that grows on to irrigated lands. And then we are looking at that impact, the increase the crop demands due to that climate change component as well. So I'll go into a little more detail on the urbanization and the climate change, because those ended up being two very big drivers in the planning scenarios. So the graphic at the bottom is really, it's looking at the town of Eaton. It's in that corridor that we're really expecting to have a lot of population growth. That's just from 1999 to 2016. And you can very clearly see how fields within the municipal boundaries and directly adjacent to have been urbanized. They've been turned into subdivisions. So what we tried to do, it was well beyond the scope of this effort to be able to really look at every single municipality and understand how they're going to grow and at what rates and how they may change their boundaries and things like that. So we took a fairly consistent spatial approach to where we were looking at the irrigated acreage within or directly adjacent to current municipal boundaries. And we essentially said that by 2050, if that basin was showing growth, those parcels may come out of production. This is an assumption that can be changed by basin roundtables in the future. Nothing's set, but we were trying to give the group something to work with and start with and be able to tweak from there. This approach does not capture, again, that it captures only the urbanization of irrigated acreage only. If you grow onto non-irrigated land, it's not going to impact the agricultural demand. And then we had no assumptions on magnitude or direction of municipal growth. So those numbers turned out to be relatively large. So the table on the right-hand side is looking at the maximum urbanized acreage. Again, if the basin wasn't showing growth in a particular planning scenario, which in some basins occurred in the weak economy, where there was no municipal growth projected, then we would not look at that we would essentially set that urbanized acreage to zero. But we're essentially estimated 152,000 acres statewide that may come out of production just because of that urbanization. Then in addition to that, we worked with stakeholders in the South Platte River Basin and the Arkansas River Basin to understand acres that were currently in water court or that were potentially had already been transferred and were going to come out of production in the future, to come up with that additional dry up. So depending upon the scenarios, we worked with them to get some different levels. We're looking at an additional 42 to 63,000 acres in the South Platte and an additional 12,600 acres in the Arkansas. That comes to a grand total of 230,000 acres that could come out of production statewide by 2050. That's about 7% of our total irrigated acreage. So it's not a small number. In looking at individual basins, South Platte is obviously looking at, the hardest hit. And that, if you take their additional dry up of this potential buy and dry, as well as their urbanized acres, it's a 20% hit on their 850,000 acres. So these are real numbers. Again, the urbanization, the total number is very similar to what they came up with in SWASI 2010, but our distribution, according to kind of the basins, was pretty different. The previous effort had looked at much more urbanization of irrigated lands in the western slope. And this process kind of, just the way the approach turned out, it put kind of a bigger burden on the South Platte. So we're in the ballpark in terms of numbers, but where that might occur, we kind of looked at it a different way this go around. So then the other big driver is looking at climate. And unfortunately, the climate, to your question, got a little bit cut off. But essentially, when we're looking at climate adjustments, we have to adjust both the demands and the supply. And I'll talk about the supply a little bit later. But when we're looking at the demands, we are looking at changes in precip and changes in temperature and how that would affect the irrigation water requirement on crops. And so these were prescribed to us. This effort of developing those climate change scenarios was all done in a separate effort and kind of fed to us. It corresponded to the Colorado Water Plan. It's the Colorado River Water Availability Study Phase 2, and the information for these climate change analyses are on the websites, I believe, CWCB websites. So that being said, everybody, I think, wants to take the magic number. What's the % increase of demand, particularly for ag crops, as a result of this climate change, for either the in-between or the hot and dry predictions? And my really unfortunate answer is it's not that easy. So although that bottom right corner does give a range of what each of the basins we're looking at from a percentage, so from the east slope, it was a 4 to 25% increase for the in-between and an 11 to 39% increase for the hot and dry. The western slope was looking at a 19 to 26% increase for the in-between and a 30 to 37% increase for the hot and dry. That being said, the climate change factors vary by water district. They vary by year. And so I wanted to make sure it's going to be my general caution for the day of pulling an average number is ill-advised, particularly if you're going to use it for anything else. You really need to understand what goes into these numbers. So that example in the top that actually happens to be the White River Basin, the gray bar is the unit crop IWR, and the yellow line is the in-between IWR factor, those factors that we got. So when you multiply those together, you can see those percentages, even just for one district, range from year to year. In general, the climate change factor was lower for years that were hot and dry and higher for cool and wet years. So what these IWR factors have the effect of is bringing those years when maybe that IWR was a little bit lower, it's starting to bring them up to those hotter years. So we're not getting those dips as much as we did. So we were able to take those climate factors, multiply it by our IWR, and that green bar is reflecting that incremental increase of IWR. So that's how that worked. So we applied those in the cooperative growth and the adaptive innovation and hot growth scenarios. And that was an application that we made after making our acreage adjustments. We had to go through and make our acreage adjustments. Then we had to re-estimate IWR, apply those climate factors, and then come back and develop a new diversion demand. So we just did that over and over and over again, that same calculation. So what does this mean? It means by 2050, we're expected to need between 10.4 and 13 million acre feet of diversions and pumping to meet the IWR and 5.5 to 6.2, to meet 5.5 to 6.2 million acre feet of crop demand on 2.8 to 2.9 million acres. So statewide, we're looking at a reduction of between 300 to 4,000 acres. But as you can see, that with that climate change, that demand's not going down in the same amount. So we are looking at each of those scenarios, and we're trying to say what's in the slide is this acreage numbers again in the yellow. These are statewide numbers. And then by planning scenario, we have our average IWR, and then the blue line is that average demand. The one that really kind of draws the attention is that adaptive innovation. And you start to really see in the adaptive innovation, it talks about these emerging technologies and the attempt to partially mitigate the effects of climate change. And you can see it makes a big difference. We're talking about, basically 3 million acre feet of demand that we're moving around because we're looking at a more efficient agricultural operation statewide. So that's where I'm going to leave it for questions. I'm sorry again if I talked fast, and I got a lot to tell you in a short time. So are there questions?
Very good.
Yes.
I'm curious for, the supply and demand side, when you look at demand in terms of land use and you looked at, municipalities and counties, did you zero in? I'm just curious, like how much you zeroed in. You look at, town or county master plans or land use development codes for, you could, like Summit County, I'm a former county commissioner, where you could have on the surface, it may seem like, hey, there's land available for agriculture needs, but it may be county open space where you would never, it's going to be consistent with open space. You're not going to see any development. You're not going to see any, agriculture uses there in the future. And then I also have a question: where does forest health play into this? Do you consider forest health part of agriculture or not?
I'm not sure. I guess for the first component, I'm not sure. I understood that the ask. I mean, was the ask essentially whether or not we looked at some of those master planning things? Yeah. We did not go to that detail, mostly because I think that would be finding a master plan consistently across the state for 2050 conditions would be a fairly big ask, particularly as it applies to the planning scenarios. We would need master plans that would correlate directly to the planning scenarios narrative. So that was something that was maybe beyond the scope. Again, basin roundtables, if they have additional information. So we relied from the agricultural standpoint on the delineated acreage that the state develops every 5 years. So I guess that was maybe the first question. And then we, from an agricultural perspective, did not look at forest health. If that is maybe something that you guys can enlighten more on, I'm not sure I can.
Correct, Director Gibbs. So both of those, unfortunately, were beyond the scope of this analysis. So we did not have the resources to dive into the master plans. We just looked at the growth boundaries and kind of did the overlay with the good data that we do have out of the DSS system. Similarly, with forest health, we do have a very small mention in the report, about forest health issues and the importance of those with regard to the environmental and rec piece that we have. But we note, again, that was beyond our scope to really look at any sort of a GIS analysis or otherwise kind of how that might affect hydrology or anything else. So and again, that is something, as Karen mentioned, that could very well play into basin implementation plan updates. So we have a whole host of things that we've kind of put on the list that could be explored, and we do have funding that we'll talk more about in the next session, kind of when we pivot to the next steps. But we did get funding through the CWCB projects bill just this last session in the amount of $5.5 million overall. Of which the bulk of that is for this whole process to update the basin plan. So we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Director Dutton.
Thanks, Kara. I just wanted to thank you for the approach that you took and for the agriculture update. I think as you very colorfully explained, the state is really diverse, and I think you went above and beyond in visiting with people and meeting with stakeholders and really taking the time to try to understand the local issues and nuances. So thank you for doing that. And of course, Greg, all of your staff as well. But it was really great to see Kara down in our neck of the woods and to have a back and forth about our future needs and future outlook. So thank you.
Thank you.
As an example of hot growth in agriculture, could you use this tool to visualize the changes in water of the hemp bubble? I know it'd be complicated. There's probably some new acreage going in. There's probably some crop switching going on. And some of the examples we heard earlier, they're using drip irrigation. So it's obviously very efficient. Would that be just too complicated a thing for you to do? Or have you ever thought about something like that?
I guess the short answer is it's certainly not too complicated to incorporate. It's really just having that information. The narratives did speak to food security and kind of some of the bigger economic drivers on the agricultural community and what it may look like in the future. But those are well outside of what we can there's so many factors outside of Colorado, including the global food chain, that we would have to really get a handle on. That being said, if we had a, basin roundtable that said by 2050, we understand that this is what the crop change scenario would look like. This is how much hemp we plan on growing. We can absolutely get it into the models. So
I'm mostly looking at how much water change in water use as a result of the bubble.
And that, do you guys want to take, you guys looked like you wanted to grab it.
We
So
didn't look at that specifically, but we did have a long conversation in one of our technical advisory group meetings about future crops. I mean, if we have hotter and drier conditions, are we going to see a different mix of crops to adapt to that? And what kinds of crops would those be? And as we all talked about it, we concluded that it's just really too hard to understand exactly what might happen and make a projection of that. But we did include in the ag demand assessment a 10% reduction in irrigation water requirement for crops in the adaptive innovation scenario, assuming that that may happen. We don't know exactly what crops might be grown, but we wanted to include some kind of a reflection of lower water use crops in the future. So,
Yeah.
Didn't exactly answer your question, but it.
yeah,
We're all interested in
yeah. Representative Citron.
Quickly, well, thank you. Build off of what Director Gibbs mentioned, and I'm curious. I know, Greg, you mentioned that there is a mention, as there is in the water plan, about how forest health contributes and can be quantified, I guess, in the environment and recreation category. I'm really curious to know if there's a way to quantify how forest conditions impacts snowpack as well, whether post-fire scars, you've got a bunch of unshaded area. I'm clearly not a scientist, but that would melt faster or evaporate more versus healthier forests and how that might hold snowpack. Curious if there's a way to incorporate that into future projections as well.
That's a great question. I think the answer is at this point, we don't know. We do know there have been some good studies, and it's certainly an emerging field right now. So one study in particular that we helped to fund up in the North Platte Basin. So there's a lot of work that's occurring, but I don't know that, we've really put that into action yet. But I think absolutely in the next, 5-10 years, we could start looking at that.
Yeah. That and that also came up in the tag to essentially in the planning scenario tag to look at, do we incorporate some of those, again, are we going to look at a wildfire, in one of the planning scenarios? So then you say where, when, again, it can be done if we can get those conditions kind of quantified consistently that we can apply that. So that's where we're there. Mr. Harris? Yes. Oop.
Well, my question is you assume that the irrigation water requirement increased. Do you assume there's a water supply to meet that irrigation water?
Not yet. That's in the next, when you see me again. So no, all I'm trying.
So your top line may not be true. There is a water supply by there.
That is true. It's just the demand for water. I'm going to come back and tell you that it's not all there. I'll give you but the only way when we're looking at really looking at these tools, the only way to evaluate these what if scenarios is to be able to give it a demand, give it a supply, and then let those water rights and demands run. And then we can tell you what the shortages are. So spoiler alert, it's not there. So.
Okay, so I wanted to add, I've got 3 things, so let's count them down. I wanted to build off of what Aaron just said. I think that the conversation about forest health and especially fire response would probably be best contemplated in the basin plan updates, since all the different basins have distinctly different forest and soil types. And so I think that would be a really great place for the IBCC to interact with the basin plans and help facilitate that conversation, but really thinking about where are those local differences. And we've got a whole heck of a lot of spruce fir, and that's going to respond a lot different in Pikes Peak granite with the ponderosa pine forest. And so maybe if we can put a pin in that discussion for the basin plan updates. And then behind you guys, we have Director Anderson and Sean Cronin, who have been wanting to make a comment. So if we could let these guys weigh in.
Was that 3 or 2?
Me, Steve, Sean.
Perfect. Okay. I'll get to you, Sean.
The increase you saw in demand for the increase in temperatures are a result of climate change. You weren't looking at any changes in cropping patterns or those types of things, I assume.
That is correct. So we did not look at any cropping changes in this analysis.
Yeah, and I would maintain that if you give a farmer a longer growing season, he's going to take advantage of that. So
Right.
your demand might be somewhat less than what might happen in the future.
Or shifted. I mean, we're looking at it occurring in a different time of the year. And it's interesting because I think when I come back around and talk to you guys about what the changed hydrology is looking at, you're right. It does speak to a change in growing season, but it also speaks to a change in supply. And I think using those two pieces of information together may be more informative to what the Basin Roundtables may look at in terms of, what if we did this with agriculture in this scenario? So I think maybe using those two pieces, the big concern that we had is if we had put too many inevitabilities into the demand scenarios, and because they're all lumped together, we can't look at one just the way this scenario planning was done. We wanted to make sure we didn't put too much in there so that it might not allow the Basin Roundtables to then come back and say, we want to make this change and this change and this change. And that's something, again, that we can look at the next technical update too as well. I mean, now that we've got this methodology in place, we can improve on it. So, Representative Cronin.
Karen, just I want
Yes.
to confirm what I think I understand and then a question on that. So, so it was looking at the current diversions and then the irrigation water requirement, the delta between that coming up with this, what the need or the demand might be.
Do you want me to go back to the currently slide? Is that what you're?
No.
Okay.
I'm just confirming, is that accurate, that's what the analysis did or part of the
It's the
analysis?
demand.
Okay.
It's the current demand. There's no diversions in any of these numbers. We haven't put a supply to it yet. We don't know if we can meet it. Okay.
And then what's the scale of all that? Is it for the South Platte, for example, is that on the South Platte scale basis, or does it go down to each sub-basin? Can I look at St. Vrain? Can I look at individual ditches on what that would be?
You can look at individual ditches. Okay. So the way that, sorry, Greg's like, talking to the, I'm awful at this. So essentially all of the consumptive use and surface water model allocations that we use to develop all these numbers, they're all up on the FDP site. They're all available. You have the current along with all of the planning scenarios. They do look at ditch level. That being said, we did not make ditch to ditch decisions particularly. I mean, we were looking at a regional planning scale and we're applying this same procedure kind of to everybody in a water district. So we were really trying to look at water districts, making decisions about everybody in there because we did not have the information to make individual decisions about ditches. So, but it's in there again at midnight reading. Okay. Any other questions?
All right, keep moving along and hand things over to Bayor and Courtney.
Okay. I'm Bayorn with Element Water Consulting, and I am here to talk to you about the municipal and industrial demands. And so first starting off, what's new about the municipal industrial demands? I'm going to tell you a little bit about the information we had and the methodology that we used, and then we'll show you some interim results and then finally bring it all together to show you comparably what the municipal and industrial demands look like for the scenarios. So what for the municipal demands, one of the first steps is we look at the baseline demand. So what do demands look like today? Or in this case, our baseline was the year 2015. And one of the most exciting things about this update is we have this substantial new data source that Matt mentioned, which is the House Bill 1051 data, that provided water use data representing about 70% of the state's population in 2015. So that's a substantial data source. Then we had these municipal water efficiency plans that typically get published about every 7 years. We had a little over 11% of the state's population represented by those. And then we also gained some additional information from targeted outreach and basin implementation plans. And a couple of things that are really exciting about that data. One is it's new, so it's more recent and representative. But second, most of these data sources that we used have multiple years of data, and they break it down by customer category. So we can look at residential versus non-residential use, indoor versus outdoor. We just have a whole lot more information to base our analyses on. And that data keeps coming. The 1051 database just keeps building. It's an annual reporting. So you're going to continue to get better and better data in this category, which is really great. Then, so that's the baseline data. We also had some new data for the industrial uses too. And then for the scenarios, we are using the scenario planning approach, which is totally new, as we've talked about. And then finally, we were preparing these demands in a way that could go into the hydrologic models that Kara's going to talk to you about next. So most of the results that I'm about to show you, we have summarized up at a statewide level. We show you a little bit of basin scale level, but all of these demands were calculated for every individual county. And we started with individual water provider data and then used that to build up to the county and to the basin data, and even worked with Kara to get some of these demands put at specific nodes in the model to represent those municipal demands. So that's completely different than anything we've done with Swazi. Okay, so these this chart shows the updated baseline per capita municipal demands. So this is in gallons per capita per day. The gray bars are the baseline data that we had in Swazi 2010, and the green bars are the updated baseline. So Swazi 2010 had a baseline year of 2008. The update has a baseline year of 2015. And on a statewide basis, which is the two bars on the far right, statewide per capita demands have decreased from 172 to 164 gallon per capita per day. So that is, on a statewide basis, that is about 5% reduction over 7 years. The differences are much more significant at a county level. This we've summarized here at a basin level, and you can see some basins have more difference than others. Where there are reductions, that probably reflects the progress that's been made with conservation or demand management, as well as new construction that's typically more efficient than older construction in the residential sector, particularly, also in the commercial. And then the other thing, in places where you see the new GPCD numbers be higher, sometimes we've looked closely at all those and understand them, at each county level, but sometimes that is because in this update, we have included the uses of raw water and reuse water, and we needed to do that to reflect the demands coming from the river for the hydrologic. The prior analyses didn't have those sources of water in them. So we just looked at the baseline GPCD numbers. The next step, as we move into working toward preparing these projections at the year 2050, we turn back to the Colorado Water Plan. And as Matt described, we have the 5 scenarios. These are words. I'm not going to go through all the words on the slide. You can kind of take a peek. The key words that are bolded are the ones that we really honed in on for understanding what the municipal situation would be under these scenarios. And this was really one of the key challenges with this analysis, is that we were trying to stay true to the scenarios. We also had these glasses of water at the top show relative rankings, where the Colorado Water Plan said under these 5 scenarios, the municipal and industrial demands will be lowest in the weak economy and highest under hot growth. So that was another influence of our methodology. And we had really good interaction with our technical advisory group working on this, because we had kind of a skeleton of a model to be able to see what some of these influences would do. But then we really put them to work, and they gave a lot of good input on what do we do when the first time you run this, they don't come out in the sequence that the water plan envisioned. So they gave a lot of really good insight and feedback on that process. So we'll come back to these 5 rankings, and if you have questions, we can come back to this slide. Okay, so we've got the scenarios. First, we're going to look at how those scenarios play out for population, because with municipal demands, you take the future population times some future rate of use in gallons per capita per day, and that tells you how much volume is going to be associated with the municipal demands. So this is a summary of, on the left, we've got the 2015 baseline population, which came straight from the state demographer. That is about 5.5 million people. It is a little bit lower than where we had projected when we were sitting back at SWASI 2010 and we had projected the year 2015. 2015 actually is a little lower than what SWASI 10 had projected. And then the business as usual also came straight from the state demographer. The other 4 sets of population, the other 4 scenarios, were prepared by BBC consultants. And if you look at this chart, it looks like there are only 3 future populations, because on a statewide basis, the business as usual and the cooperative growth are the same, kind of at the medium level. The weak economy is the lowest. Business as usual and cooperative growth are the same. And then adaptive innovation on hot growth are the same on a statewide level. But what BBC did is, again, they're doing all their analysis at a county level for us, but they used the information from the Colorado Water Plan scenario descriptions to reflect the different movement to urban centers and to mountain communities. And some of that was also directly in response to the climate effects. So here's a snapshot of how the 5 scenario population projections compare across the basins. And probably no surprise, the current population, most of the state is within 3 basins, and the future stays the same, but they're all different because the analysis was all applied at a county level. And then these graphics are just showing you the summary. Okay, so that's the population. That's the first step of our municipal demands. Next, we were applying these different drivers to the current water use rate. So whatever you're using today in gallon per capita per day is influenced by different drivers out at 2050 that are described in the water plan. And the climate is another one of the big factors. And Kara did a good job describing the climate scenarios that we had. We used the same information as for the agricultural demands. We also had business as usual and the weak economy at the current, cooperative growth in between, and adaptive innovation and hot growth at the hot and dry. Same data. Unlike Kara, just because of the way that our methodology is, the stepwise process, unlike the ag demands, we are able to show you directly what that climate factor influence does to the rate of use in gallons per capita per day. So here we have for the 5 future scenarios, so these are the 5 futures, year 2050, the green is with the climate factors applied. The gray is what it would be like if we had no influence of climate. And I think when you look at this chart, it probably doesn't look as significant as it really is, because this chart shows only a difference of 5 to 10 gallon per capita per day between with and without climate. However, at the individual county level, there are counties that have their outdoor use increasing by 4 to 22% on the in-between climate, and by 11 to 37% on the hot and dry. So it is a very significant effect on the outdoor water use in some areas. This chart is really just a visual to show you those same numbers that were just presented on the last slide with the climate effect in them. We actually have all of that data broken down by the customer class. So all of the analysis preserves the individual residential, indoor and outdoor, non-residential, indoor and outdoor, and non-revenue water. Non-revenue water is the difference between what is produced and leaves, say, the water treatment plant or the wellhead, and what makes it to the end use. So the metered billing data, that's the non-revenue water. Okay, switching to the industrial methodology, just to keep some perspective here, the top pie chart with the blue and the gray and the red shows the demands from municipal and industrial uses relative to agriculture. So just to keep perspective as we move into looking at the impacts of ag and M&I demands on the hydrologic models. However, that's on a statewide basis. Of course, there's areas where the individual impacts are much higher. Then moving down, the industrial is about 15% of the M&I. So the industrial is generally pretty small relative to the municipal. I should explain, the industrial in this category are those uses that have their own individual water supply, or they have a lease, say a wholesale water contract with a municipal provider. They're not all of the more in smaller industrial uses that are within the municipal demands. So this is the 4 categories. We kept the 4 categories that were described, have been used in the prior SWASI efforts. Those are energy development, large industry, snowmaking, thermoelectric. And we had some good new data from targeted outreach and basin implementation plans. This is a place where the technical advisory also was very, very helpful. We had some representatives that could help us fill in data that is not generally available in published reports. And I also emphasize this is a place where basin roundtables could help a lot to get industry representatives to help fill in some updates to this type of data. Again, we had the Colorado Water Plan with the description of the influences of the 5 scenarios, and just kind of bringing it all together. Here is the combined municipal and industrial demands. The darker blue is the municipal, the lighter blue is the industrial, and then the circles show the population. So you can see some interesting things in this chart, in that when we look at going back to those glasses of water, we came very close. We were able to match that sequence on the municipal demands, which is 85% of this combined category. But when we coupled it with the industrial, we just couldn't quite get there. The adaptive innovation and the business as usual numbers are almost identical when you combine them. They're less than 0.5% off. And we did a lot of sensitivity around that, trying to see if we made different assumption adjustments, and even went back to the tag for some input, and finally decided this was the right place to land. There's a couple of scenarios that we have talked about in the reporting, and kind of as a team that we found interesting here. There's probably a lot more that are different and interesting on an individual basin level, and then even different when you look at the county. But on a statewide level, the business as usual and the adaptive innovation, the fact that those come out so close is really interesting, because the adaptive innovation has the higher population, which you can see by that circle there, and it has a much, much warmer climate. And so what that is showing is that the demand management or conservation efforts that are happening reflective in the scenario description are essentially mitigating the population and climate change that are happening relative to the business as usual. The other two that are very interesting to compare that way are the adaptive innovation and the hot growth, because those both have, you can see they both have the high population, they both have the hot and dry climate, but yet the adaptive innovation is coming in so much lower than the hot growth. And again, that is reflecting the mitigation from technology, behavioral changes, and just the level of conservation that we assumed in that future scenario description. So finally, I only have a couple more slides for you. The M&I demand methodology is more similar to prior SWASI analyses than the ag is. Like Kara said, the full demands were never reflected in the prior SWASI. So we know it's pretty natural to look at this and say, let's go back and see what did the prior SWASI show. We want to know. And you can do it with the population. So this is how the population compares. We don't have any population projections that are as high in 2050 as SWASI 2010 had. They've all come down. And even our highest are pretty similar to what the median population was before. And then our medium is similar to what the lowest was, and weak economy is quite a bit lower. So that's pretty straightforward. The next one we're going to show you, and it's mostly just to caution you about maybe don't do this, or if you do this, be very careful and understand how complex it is and how you might, it might lead you to think that you see things that aren't fully understood just by doing this simple analysis. So the challenge when you bring all the demands together and you look at a volumetric level, the challenge with trying to go back to SWASI 2010 is, first of all, SWASI 2010 didn't have any climate effect in it. So from that aspect, you really should only be able to look at the business as usual and the weak economy. And I just showed you the populations are substantially different between the two as well. So for that reason, you can't think that the high is the high from before and the low is low. They're very different. On top of that, one of the very important factors here that we go into great detail in our volume 2 analysis and a little in the volume 1 is that we used a different approach that embeds a level of conservation or demand management that is described in the scenarios. We don't start with a future without conservation and then say a certain amount comes down from passive, which is what would happen naturally, retrofits and new construction, and then here's another bit of active. We don't have that. It is all embedded because the scenarios describe a very specific situation. And so when you go back to the prior SWASI that used the passive and active, you have to pick which one you look at. And on top of it, the prior SWASI only did that for the medium population. So you can't even do it for the lower or higher population. So just exercise caution if you naturally want to do this, but there is a lot of interesting comparisons you can find. And that is it.
Thanks, Bjorn. Any questions for Bjorn? Steve?
You use just the data. Average, you're very variable.
Yeah, so we have the 2015 population for that year, and we used the range of data that we had. And we did a lot of analysis of when we had multiple years. We were looking to see, fortunately, the grouping of years we had, we didn't have any extreme 2002 kind of drought in it or that sort of thing, but we did look at the range of years and picked an average around that. Correct.
Other questions? Great. Well, we'll keep moving along and hand things back to Kara. This is the last piece. We're in the home stretch now.
Hi again. So now what I'm going to walk through is, as I promised earlier, so now we have our demands. between the agriculture and the municipal component. And now we really have to figure out, we're going to put it through some pretty rigorous water supply and try to come up with our gap numbers. So we're kind of ready to present some of those to you. So first of all, let's talk about what is the gap. The gap is the amount of additional water supply that would need to be diverted or pumped to meet any demand. And so we, within our tools, are able to look at an individual demand. And so we're able to look at whether or not there is an M&I gap or an agricultural gap. We're able to look at that, at an individual ditch level and then bring it up to these watershed basin levels. So we really are going to look at now of how that gap is estimated. So we take our water supply, we take our natural flow, which, I will get into, but changes in the planning scenarios. Some are climate adjusted now versus just assuming historical is going to happen again. So we took our natural flow water supply, we take our ag demands, we take our M&I demands, and we kind of put them into these tools. We're fortunate in the state of Colorado to have CWCB and DWR develop these water supply, surface water allocation models and tools so that we can use. These are fantastic what-if tools. They're perfect for this kind of analysis. What if our demands change? What if our hydrology changes? What are we going to get that comes out of it? So again, lots of documentation on this, good nighttime reading in our volume 2. But the short story is that we really have these surface water allocation models. They look at, once we input all this information, they look at the physical and legal water availability, essentially to any demand based on water rights and hydrology. It's looking at both of those components. It's going to allocate water based on that user's water rights relative. It operates according to prior appropriation, just like our administration system. And so it's allocating water based on that physical, legally available, and it's allocating the amount of water that would be available under those water rights. And it's essentially going through this entire system, allocating water, calculating return flows, and then it spits out a ton of information. So it's really allocating water based on the current set of infrastructure, water rights, reservoir storage. We're really looking at whatever's on the ground right now. We didn't implement any future projects. We weren't looking at any other kind of improvements to those systems outside of what we have right now. That really tees up the fact that we are giving this gap to the basin roundtables and asking them to go to work and come up with those solutions that can be evaluated in these tools, but we're certainly not in a position to be able to prescribe those solutions. So once it's able to go through all of these, numerous simulations, really what it spits out at the end, we're looking at how much the demand is met, how much unappropriated supply may be available in a basin, and again, when that might be available, if ever. M&I and agricultural gaps. We're looking at stream flow. So we're looking at stream flow, and we, really looked at it both from an average monthly perspective and a time series, and we'll walk through some of those results. And we're also looking at the impact to reservoir storage. So we've got a lot of information that we're trying to work through. So now I want to step back just a little bit and talk about that, the climate adjusted hydrology. And so this was, as I mentioned previously, he's had enough. He was done. As I mentioned previously, we have to adjust both of the demands and the water supply. So we were given, along with the climate change scenarios, current is as if the historical hydrology is going to occur again into the future. Cooperative growth is an adjusted kind of water supply value. Again, this was all done through the CRAS Phase 2 effort. And then the adaptive innovation and hot growth was also a separate set of hydrology. And in general, as depicted by the graphic, the in-between and the hot and dry scenarios essentially projected reduced overall stream flow. But more importantly, as we started to look through the results, it's that shift. It's essentially looking at a shift of that peak runoff in many areas going from June back to a May, and in warmer areas, it's that's just the example that's kind of up there. In warmer areas, even going earlier than that, so going from a May to an April. So, and when you're talking about basins that don't have a significant amount of storage, and you're talking about basins that rely on that stream flow runoff to meet demands, that shift almost turned out to be a bigger impact on the gap results than the reduction in stream flow, which is kind of an interesting outcome that we got from it. Again, as with everything, we had this information at over 300 locations in the state of Colorado at gauge locations. So this is not the trend. If you pull your gauge outside of your house, it may not look exactly the same. It also varied month to month, year to year. So again, a lot of data. This is my beginning of cautioning you to look at averages. So we were able to use that hydrology in each of the planning models. So we, again, kind of in the spirit of what Becky was saying, this is what it is and this is what it isn't. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the gap analysis, the limitations to what we have. So these are basin-wide planning models. They operate on a monthly time step. We're looking at regional level planning adjustments and implementation of those at very large scales. We don't have them everywhere. We are certainly working on them. We have them for the entire Western Slope. We have them for the South Platte Basin, but and we're working on developing those in the Arkansas, but we do not have these surface water allocation models everywhere. And so we had to look at other options in those basins to estimate those gaps. For example, in the Republican, we were able to look at the Republican River compact accounting to come up with some estimates. In the Arkansas, we were able, for better or for worse, when you're looking at the Rio Grande and the Arkansas basins, they're essentially the two basins with the least amount, the most over appropriated. That's fair. Yeah. The most over appropriated. So it turns out that you can use historical shortages to kind of inform what those future conditions and then adjust them to make them worse for climate change, for better or for worse. So we were able to kind of rely on historical information and shortages when we didn't have the models. Model calibration. These models have hundreds of ditches and thousands of water rights. We have done our best to calibrate them. They rely on information that's developed by DWR, Streamflow, USGS, NOAA. I mean, we certainly have tried our best and worked on the calibration over the years, but it's only as good as the data that goes into it. To the extent that data is errant, missing, and we're trying to kind of build that information, it may not be, it may not accurately represent what's occurring in that tributary or that specific location. We love people to get in there and tell us areas where they can be fixed. And we are fully anticipating in the Basin Roundtables as they look at these to come back and say, that reservoir is not doing what we think it is. Let's go ahead and fix it. So we can make those adjustments. They always get better. And this is the first time we've really taken the South Platte. The South Platte surface water model was completed, essentially 2 years ago. And this is the first big analysis that we've done and looked at it. So we're expecting feedback. So Jim's like, I'll take notes. Yeah, I'm sure. So there's my caveat. Oh, there's my caveat there. Representation of operations. We have one set of operations that's in the model. They're likely simplified. They are simplified. I wouldn't even say they're likely. That's trash. They are simplified. So, and they're really trying to represent the operations that are occurring 90% of the time. They do not capture the full suite of what every single water provider has out there and options. They do not replace any irrigator decision or other operational decision. They likely do not represent drought operations as sufficiently as they should. Again, that doesn't mean the models can't, but we had to develop essentially one set of operations for them to work on. And then groundwater pumping and transbasin imports, and I'll talk a little bit more about transbasin a couple slides down, but groundwater pumping, actually both of these, we did not attempt to even project how those may change into the future. I think it's safe to say that groundwater pumping is not going to get any larger. We felt that was a strong enough assumption. And so we were really using current levels of pumping to cap the amount of pumping that we could project in the future. And then Transbasin, as I mentioned, I'll get to that in just a hot second. So we're going to get into gap results. We're going to get into average gap results and lots of data. Just remember, average doesn't represent everything everywhere. So really, and Matt had kind of already alluded to this, but when we're looking at the M&I gap, we're looking at between 1/4 and 3/4 of a million acre feet of municipal, M&I gap projected under the planning scenarios. This, again, I think I mentioned it does not include any mitigation from an IPMP perspective. This is really just the raw results of what we're thinking or what we've projected as the M&I gap under each of these planning scenarios. The total ag gap is 2.2 to 3.3 million acre feet. Again, that includes that existing component, which is well over 2 million in itself. And as we alluded to before, the incremental ag gap then, and this is just the increase as a result of the planning scenario adjustments, are between 23,000 and 1 million acre feet by the time you get into the hot growth scenario. And I'm going to let these guys jump in when they feel like there's more to say, but we're going to fly through these pretty quick. They are certainly in your reports that you guys can go back to. So
maybe point out real quick that those incremental gaps really start to appear when you get into the climate change scenarios.
Yeah, very small under existing hydrology, at least the incremental component of it. So diving into those ag gaps a little bit more, we're looking at ag gaps in those climate adjusted increasing between 18 to 43% beyond the baseline condition. And I will remind you that that's with the removal of between 300 and 4,000 acres of irrigated land. So we're taking acreage out of production and we're still seeing these incremental gaps. The ag gaps are less in the adaptive innovation than the hot growth, despite they're using the same climate adjustments. And that's really due to those emerging technology factor where we sought to partially mitigate the impacts of climate and then improve those efficiencies. So you can kind of start to see if you are comparing, and it's not quite apples to apples, but if you are comparing the cooperative growth, which is using the in-between climate adjustment versus the adaptive innovation, those results start to look very similar. So it turns out the planning scenario factors or adjustments did mitigate at least a partial increase.
Which, yeah, and those planning scenario adjustments and the adaptive innovation, again, were assuming that irrigators would maybe shift crop types to something less consumptive and would have a 10% less irrigation water requirement. And also perhaps there would be some improvements to conveyance efficiencies. And so we improved our conveyance efficiencies by 10%, which puts less of a draw on supplies. So.
Absolutely. Diving in a little bit to the M&I results, from a statewide perspective, M&I does not currently experience a gap, so baseline's 0. So every new gap in the planning scenarios is the incremental M&I gap. Essentially, we're looking at that increasing population, warmer climate is really what's driving that, the creation of the gaps, despite some levels of conservation in those demands. There is absolutely room for additional conservation to be included into those demands, and how that may pan out from a gap perspective. You guys can run the models and we can see. But it just, as a note that those can certainly, this conservation levels can certainly be increased.
And maybe I'll just jump in too and just remind you that those are maximum year, really dry year gaps for municipal and industrial uses. In the modeling, the gaps aren't always that high. They're
Right.
in some years, they're much less. So.
Right. And they range by basin, by location, by year, But yeah, we are looking at the M&I gap in critically dry years. So again, these do not include any IPMPs. I'm not sure we can stress that enough because I think we've said it 47 times. Nor do they look at watering restrictions or any drought responses that a municipality may impose as they look at what those planning scenarios may send their way. So from a basin perspective, I'm not sure this comes as, as any surprise, but we're looking at, these are the M&I gaps by basin, by planning scenario, for critically dry years. Those basins with the largest municipal growth and the lowest amount of unappropriated flows to meet those future demands, turns out you're going to have the largest gaps. Not sure. I have a feeling this is like Captain Obvious here, a lot of this. But it is kind of nice to see the comparison. And I will remind folks that the scale on the left-hand side is 600,000 acre feet. So we are talking about substantial amounts of water when we're looking at some of these M&I gaps and how they vary. It'll be really interesting to see what the basin roundtables do with kind of this information to see which gap number to maybe attack first. So from an agricultural perspective by basin, again, no surprise, this is the total agricultural gap, although keep in mind that the business as usual and weak economy gaps tend to be very similar to what they are historically. I will provide the incremental ag gap in the next slide. As you have essentially the basins with the largest acreage and the most limited water supplies are going to have the biggest gap. So there we go again. I will remind folks that this is a 900,000 acre foot scale, and we're talking about annual gaps. So this amount of water from an annual perspective. So again, looking at the differences, comparing, contrasting one basin to the next is you guys can draw your own conclusions as you read those reports. This is the average incremental ag gap. So interestingly enough, the Arkansas and the Southwest basins tend to have the largest gaps. And that is, that's really in part, that's telling to what the climate scenarios are really, projecting down there. So as I mentioned, they vary across basin. And so they were not distributed equally. So it's kind of interesting to see that those two have the largest incremental gaps as a result of those planning scenarios. The South Platte Metro with no average incremental gap. And again, we removed 150,000 acres out of the South Platte. So essentially we reduced that agricultural demand from baseline conditions so that even by the time you applied the planning scenario adjustments, it wasn't enough to create an incremental gap. So that's kind of the reason why that incremental gap looks zero for the South Platte. And then interestingly enough, the business as usual and weak economy show up in the North Platte. And that's because the North Platte actually put additional acreage under production, and they do experience shortages, water shortages as well in that basin. So. Okay, so this is a little bit more information. We wanted to provide a little bit more information on the urbanized lands. So as I mentioned, we essentially took 230,000 acres out of production. We recognized that this water, that essentially the water that was used to irrigate those crops could be a source of new supply for either an M&I or any other demand in the basin. So we wanted to quantify these numbers at a high level because we wanted to make sure the basin roundtables had that information. But in reality, there is a ton of uncertainty associated with these assumptions. Not only the historical consumptive use associated with it, we did not go to the level of whether or not they were a senior or a junior right, whether or not they had supplemental storage, whether or not, all of the things that kind of come into that HCU analysis. So high level planning. So the uncertainty, both from a historical consumptive use quantification perspective and also how municipalities or any other demands may use this in the future. We didn't try to tie an urbanized, the historical consumptive use from an urbanized parcel to any municipality. We have no idea if there's exchange potential. We didn't look at whether or not it's a direct. We didn't know if they would use it for augmentation as a direct supply. We didn't know if they'd store it. We didn't know how often they would reuse it. So in light of these uncertainties, we're providing these numbers, but we did not adjust the M&I gap to reflect these numbers. And it will have the effect of reducing the M&I gap. as these are implemented, and we invite the basin roundtables to look at these numbers and start filling in those blanks. But we certainly didn't do that for you. And just before anybody else does, because we know it's an easy way to compare those tables, remember that these are depletion numbers, and our gap is based on a diversion perspective. So this is not an apples to oranges where you can just take them. Because oftentimes historical consumptive uses are truly used to offset municipal depletions. So, and it really matters on what you're looking at from a whole water supply portfolio. So there's a significant amount of water that may be available. We've quantified it, we've provided it. It may decrease the gap, but Basin Roundtables get to go to work on that. The next one, so speaking of uncertainty, these are trans-basin diversions. We had to make some assumptions on what to do with trans-basin diversions in the modeling. In short, we opted to reflect the historical imports in the model from the west slope to the east slope. We used historical diversions. We did not, it is safe to say that trans-basin diverters would absolutely look at different operations if they were given these different planning scenarios, because it depends on so much. It depends on how much supply or demand they have in the source basin, the destination basin, how it works with the rest of their water supply. So we did not try to make those assumptions and understand how that would work. So understanding that we're sitting at the historical levels, we did want to look at how the planning scenarios may impact the ability for the east slope to even import those historical levels. So even without changing them. So we're looking at, in a west slope perspective, we're looking at increasing the agricultural demands because we've looked at increasing CIR or IWR, and we've dropped the hydrology. So we were able to quantify, and that's what this graphic represents, we were able to quantify potentially how much an east slope basin may be shorted under these different planning scenarios due to changes in hydrology and demands in the western slope. This does not reflect anything more than that. This is not a compact discussion. This is exactly a result of the planning scenarios the planning scenario adjustments that we've laid out in our documentation and report. So the blue represents, on average, 500,000 acre feet is essentially imported to the east slope basin from the western slope. And on average, we're looking at, up to maybe 50,000 acre feet shortage. In critically dry years, due to under the climate adjusted scenarios, we didn't see any shortages from an east slope import demand under the business as usual or weak economy. So from the climate adjusted, now we're starting to get into, under the hot growth scenario in a critically dry year, 150,000 acre foot shortage to east slope imports. So again, in light of this uncertainty, we did not adjust either the ag or the M&I because these imports are used for both of those purposes in the eastern slope. We did not adjust it. It would have the effect of increasing the gap, but it's also difficult to know exactly how, because when trans-basin diversions get brought over, they certainly get used multiple times within the state, either by the entity that brought them over or by the users downstream. Jim. So we wanted to provide the information, but we did not adjust the demand, we did not adjust the gap to reflect those numbers. So this is just, I want to fly through kind of the rest of the results and then we can get to the questions, but we were able to provide annual gap percentages, both for ag and M&I, so that we can see by planning scenario and by hydrologic year type, just what that range is. This is, again, my caution to make sure we're not just looking at one average number. We also looked at what the impact that these planning scenarios may have on basin storage. And we're providing this information. I know it looks a bit like a spaghetti plot, but you can pretty quickly pick out that the adaptive innovation and the hot growth scenarios are not able to provide as much storage or yield as they have in other scenarios. They're often not recovering as well under droughts. And so we have this type of information so that as you guys start to talk, you'll be able to incorporate this into your general discussion. So we're able to provide, I don't know my own animation, sorry. So we're looking at physical and available stream flow, both physical wet water that's sitting in the river, along with what may be available to develop from what unappropriated flow may be in the river to develop. Again, this is very location specific. It depends, you're looking at changes from year to year, but we are able to provide that time series of information. And then we're also trying to give that information to you on a monthly average level so that we can see trends and seasonality. So that's lots of data, lots and lots and lots of data. So where do we go from here? So now we have lots and lots of results. So we're going to essentially hand it back to those basin roundtables, say go to work, and we can refine these technical platforms. We can refine demands. We can refine, supply, particularly if we're starting to look at changed conditions under wildfire or other things the basin roundtables decide. We can change infrastructure, storage, operations. We can implement some decisions on what to do with that urbanized land and that potential new supply. Each basin roundtable can look at, transbasin assumptions. And then once we have those models set up, you can evaluate potential water supply projects to meet those gaps. That's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Kara. I just wanted to mention two things real quickly. Number one, I forgot to thank all the other members of the technical team. So this is just a small selection of all the folks who've worked on this. We had a number of different engineering firms, a lot of good people, some of whom were mentioned today, but a lot of work really went into this. Secondly, one thing that we were not able to get quite to the finish line by today, for the release, is a larger data visualization project that we are working on. So we are actually wrapping up an RFP process, a request for proposal, through our accounting office with DNR, but basically to get an IT firm on board to really help with all of this data, as Kara had gone through. I mean, there's a lot of data here. We've done our best to serve it up in a way that makes as much sense as possible with the report itself. We have the FTP site I mentioned where this data is actually hosted right now, but we really want to be true to the capacity that we have now in the year 2019. Actually, probably be 2020 by the time we get this out. But use a modern website. Have much better mapping technology to really display what all of this means in a much more intuitive fashion. So stay tuned on that front, and of course we're happy to dive in any other questions on this.
So forever you'll be Captain Obvious now, Kara. You know that.
I have worse names, so I suppose I'll take it. So
Help me understand from the baseline, the 2.5 million acre foot ag gap.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just crop demand minus the diversions and the pumping for the entire state?
yes.
Yeah.
So essentially, we're
So
looking
what
at
does
that.
that mean? Does that mean potentially, does it include dry land parcels as well? So maybe there wasn't enough precipitation.
Nope, it does not look at a dry land analysis. So
Not
of
at all.
that 13.3 million acre feet of demand that we wanted, we were short from a statewide perspective 2.5 million acre feet. So that's the existing gap. Then when you moved into planning scenarios, we made changes to acreage. And so, you can't just carry that gap going forward, but we are able to say from an incremental standpoint, we have an existing gap and it changes as it goes forward.
That's characterized as lost opportunity for agriculture then?
It really is just a limitation
Limitation.
of legal and physical water supply. I mean, this is really basins that are relying on that runoff. And once their runoff is done, their crops continue to want water and they have no other supply.
That was the next question. It's really deficit irrigation potentially, or you didn't.
Or
crop
just
didn't make
lost
it to
crop
full.
yield.
Crop
I
yield,
mean,
yeah.
that's getting one cutting instead of two cuttings. That's getting a cutting and then doing some grazing as opposed to getting two cuttings. That's essentially what that's represented. So
Thanks.
is that,
Captain Obvious.
thank you.
Cleve, don't pick on our people. I kind of want to be Captain Obvious too, it's obvious that you guys have put a lot of work into this, and I would be remiss if we didn't take a moment to brag on you a little bit, because Greg, you mentioned the hours of your staff, but I know you've put a lot of hours in, and this whole team at the table has undoubtedly put a lot of hours in, and this is the most in-depth and thorough and beautiful update that I think we've seen so far. So thank you for making it incredibly technical, but also really nice to look at. I participated in a tag and the working group phone calls, and I felt like your team ran those with incredible professionalism and efficiency, and really engaged the stakeholders in a meaningful way that was worth our time and also hopefully beneficial to you. I thought it went both ways and was a really, really nice outcome. And then, I really appreciated the way how the staff was reaching out to directors to get feedback, and I provided my edits, and it wasn't just a thanks Heather, see you later. Russ sent me a really detailed response to my comments, which I wasn't expecting but really enjoyed. So thank you guys for this effort. I look forward to learning more about it, but well done. Are there any other questions or comments? Feel free to pat everyone on the back as we go to break. Greg, do you have anything else to add?
I do not. No, thank you so much.
Okay.
And we have one more agenda item, but we will keep things short and sweet. We know we're running late.
I just have to say something as this is complete. Well, first of all, we need to figure out how to get everyone to move to North Platte. And then
Step one. No.
But this is the best update to technical update to Colorado's water plan that I've ever seen, even though it's the first. But I really think it's important that that folks are aware that what went into this effort. So as we look at building policy, I think it was a focus and the intent of this group to build it on the most sound and up-to-date science that is available. And that is not always the easiest route. And so we could have looked at it the way that we have looked at it before, and modified things slightly. But this was such a big jump and such a big step. And to be able to look at the agricultural gaps is a perfect example of things that we hadn't looked at before, the focus with climate change. As we are building policy within the state of Colorado and planning for our water future, I'm so confident that we have the best science going into that. And so I want to echo the appreciation for the staff and the consultant team. This was not an easy lift. I think when I hear what Lisa Darling was talking about we're all being focused on, I don't want us to be just focused on one thing. I think it is important to recognize the effort that went into this was similar to the effort that went into Colorado's water plan development. And that we have to remember that this is how we move forward. So thank you guys so much. This is the preliminary draft release. I have to reiterate that. So there are still changes, some changes to be made, and we'll look for things. And so we'll definitely be bringing this back to the board and having further discussion if necessary, but it definitely guides and informs as we move forward. So thank you.
I just got a text that there might be some interest in just plowing through instead of having a break. Is that, looks like we're seeing head nods. There's no one.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Rather than a break, then let's move on to item no number. We'll call it 25, insights, tools, and recommendations and next steps. Is there a plan for this?
No, it's right here. Yeah.
Oh, fancy. Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate the kudos on this too. It's been a lot of work, and I couldn't be more grateful for our team and for all the input that we've gotten. And to echo that, I would say our first slide here was really to kind of honor exactly what Director Mitchell and Director Hutton were discussing, that for us, we've had this, for all the comments that we've got, sometimes this is in a black box, and SWASI is what's happening with it. The reality is it just takes a ton of time to get through some of these things, and at every step we've really tried to honor the kind of the same process that went into the water plan. So starting with technical advisory groups. Oh, sorry. Russ Sands, CWCB. Thank you. So I was trying to honor that quick thing, and I know that as much love as I have for Kara, I go for the bottle of Advil every time she gets done presenting. So just being sensitive to the needs. But we have really tried to engage in this process at the very start. The water plan is, if nothing, a commitment to honoring stakeholder engagement. And we've tried to do that first with the technical advisory groups, and then this implementation working group, kind of on the tail end of this process. But throughout that, all the meetings with the roundtables, all the meetings with the boards, all the meetings with IBCC, and other stakeholders that we've engaged along the way. So just to kind of highlight that has directly resulted in, I think, real on-the-ground changes that we've made. So we've certainly done our best when we've gotten those black box comments to increase transparency, and we've done that with recording our webinars and having trying to get around and do the roundtable roadshow, for example. Just greater understanding of the concerns and limitations. We've really tried to be sensitive to what did we not get right, what did people really not like about the SWASI 2010 effort, and how, if possible, could we change that? In some cases, we learned there are limitations to doing that, and that's fair too. We learned, we took a lot through the tag on the methodology, and then that directly fed into modeling inputs and how we express things as far as outputs in the report. Funding for BIPs in support of just the entire $5.5 million ask that Greg had mentioned early on. That was a direct result of just listening to the roundtables and really understanding time and time again. I heard from the Arkansas, from the Yampa, this updating the BIPs is not an easy lift. And while we're excited to do it, we're also recognizing that's a big lift, and we don't, this volunteer board, we need support. And so we've done our best to honor that. The technical update recommendations, all the recommendations that are in this report are really direct result of that feedback that we heard, and specifically kind of vetted through the implementation working group. And that process has, at least at our last meeting, for those that were able to attend, got 100% consensus that they were supportive of those recommendations. Again, I would highlight the recommendations in the report are not meant to be, they're much more guiding document of how to, run through the next process, being the BIP updates. The C9 Summit is another great example. We heard directly from stakeholders that, gosh, we haven't met together as a group. We really want to facilitate these kind of discussions. Even the meeting today, I'm really trying to honor bringing the state together. And then we heard, getting the input on attendee grant funding and trying to make that happen. So this entire concept of reframing around the water plan really is illustrated in these steps. So we now have the technical update, and that's really just the springboard to launch into the BIP updates. I like the way that Matt kind of phrased it. We've really kind of separated out pieces of this, and so this is the kind of water planning data component, but we really need the BIPs, the projects that are going to be updated, are the first critical step of understanding what data, how can we get better data, what are the full scope of the projects, the IPPs or projects, and then getting that incorporated into a full BIP update, which ultimately will be used to update the water plan. So I just wanted to quickly highlight some of those recommendations. So these are just kind of snapshots of the report that talk about kind of the recommendations and these next steps. And again, these are kind of stakeholder driven results. But one regarding the BIPs, we kind of had this little cohort here of basically to let we understand each roundtable is different. They're going to find their own way of what the BIP update means to them. So they need to determine that scope. We heard a lot of great feedback. I think we heard some today from several folks around forest health and just incorporating and integrating other plans that are out there, like stream management plans, and how can we get better information on forest health and integrate that as we're doing BIP updates. Just simply getting better data if you have it. This report, as I think Bjorn probably spoke to, we've done a lot to get new information and new data from House Bill 1051. At the same time, that doesn't cover everyone. And I remember presenting in the Rio and kind of going back and forth on what data did we get and could we get better data. And a lot of that's going to have to be driven locally in some cases to get the data that we just don't have access to. And then just to kind of evaluate areas for improvement in the BIPs themselves. I think we heard several comments from the directors of just the BIPs. It's been some years and maybe they're stale a little bit or could be improved. I think we heard comments to those effects, and I think we've heard some real desire at the roundtable level to dig in and to kind of add and speak to some of these things we've talked about. So just updating the IPPs is the first order of business, getting better project data, getting better cost data specifically. And we talked a lot with the implementation working group too about a tier system. And I think 3 of the basins kind of evaluated tiering on some level, and we kind of collaboratively worked on just a very draft kind of spreadsheet tool that the feedback we got from the implementation working group was to take that forward and let people kind of dive into it and see how that might work. Another area is just the technical piece of this. So some basins are really far ahead and are already modeling or want to model more. Some maybe don't want to go down that road, but just evaluating and kind of stepping back through our shoes of the steps that we took to get here, to understand that and see, are there tweaks that could be made? Do the basins want to model specific projects to see how that might impact gaps in their basin? And I think a big one too is, do you need sub-basin results? So in a few cases in the Yampa White Green and in the South Platte, there's a bit of sub-basin division, but by and large, despite some of that analysis that might go down to the ditch or the county level, or the water district level, we've rolled those up into the basin level. And some of that was because in the BIPs, they might have had, I think in Colorado, it broke out into 7 different basins. We weren't 100% clear if that was valuable or used, or if it would be done the same way today. So it seemed more appropriate for that level of breakout and detail to be at the basin level during the BIP updates. There's a lot, and we've kind of reframed these up as core strategies, but the no and low regret strategies, and just revisiting those in the context of understanding that there are kind of pathways that can help us maybe work towards meeting a larger percentage of our gaps, and that have those no low regret strategies been dusted off. They're mentioned a lot in the water plan, but they certainly are foundational to meeting gaps and meeting the goals of the water plan. We also have talked about in the scenario planning discussion these signposts or benchmarks or potentially even triggers that maybe help highlight where you might need to make a change and shift. That was not in the scope of this of the technical update, but we hope that the BIP update process will help us flesh that out a bit. And then maybe just a bit of understanding. A lot of work and time went in from most of the people in this room of developing these scenarios, but now that you've seen it play out across modeling 5 different scenarios and the multiple data sets that come out of that, how helpful is that? Would we refine those moving forward, or would we keep them? And then last but not least is just looking at this from the outreach strategy. I think we got a lot of great input even early on of and some feedback of just how do we use this? What do we do with this? And this concept around rebranding around the water plan was in some ways really born out of that, those discussions, and really realizing our need to kind of take this not just to the folks in this room, but take it even more and get broader stakeholders engaged. So that's the full list of recommendations. This will be, and this kind of entire context of today's discussion, hopefully broken down a little bit more concisely. This is our first stab. Will be kind of the focus and the rollout at the Roundtable Summit, the C9 Summit in September, and we hope to see everyone there. We've got a bit of feedback too, and we're certainly open to hearing it if there's other topics that we would want to fold into that, and so we're trying to honor that as we adjust the agenda. But with that, I will turn it over if there's any questions.
Are there any questions or comments for Greg and Russ? Thanks everyone for being here. I think it was probably really helpful and a really good use of time for you guys to roll this out to both groups at once instead of having to do it twice. So that was probably really
strategic.
Nice. Director Jan.
Yeah, I just wanted to, just sitting here and listening to all this. So what I just heard was the technical update to the water plan and the way that the CWCB staff carried it out, and the outreach, the integrity, the passion to do all that. That is throughout our entire staff. So when I was thinking about that and listening to you guys, I tried to listen to everything. There was a couple times I but I caught most of it. Love it. Just kidding. No, but we're carrying that out. I just thought of this discussion before that about demand management. And I just want everybody to know that the CWC board and the staff desire to carry that out in the same manner. And so we're trying to do all of these things. There's a lot of heavy lifting that we did on this. There's a lot of heavy lifting doing on the demand management. And I just want to make sure that everyone understands that. And I realize they're different, and they require some differences in the way that we reach out to people. But we have in Colorado, I just think we have been blessed by, what Russ George did a long time ago with 1177 and setting this up so that we can do these kind of things. I think we're on the cutting edge of water in the West. And I think that the work that you guys do really shines through. And I think, that we need to remember that. And sometimes it is discouraging and tough, but we need to, I just want to encourage you to stay engaged and know, and Bill, like what you said, know that, we're not trying to be top down. We try to encourage people. I know before I was on the board, I kind of likened it to when we move cattle. We're kind of have to prod them a little bit to get going, or we wouldn't move anywhere, or we'd scatter everywhere. So sometimes we need a little bit of prodding on the round tables, and sometimes it could feel like a top down, but that's not what it's meant to be. And the board is listening to the discussions here today. So I just wanted to thank you all for your input today and all that you do and all the work that you've put into this. So thanks.
Andy.
Thank you, Heather. I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate that, Heather. And Jim, I definitely appreciate your comments. I want to touch on the openness of this process. I think it was very well done and something that I think our state should be proud of. And I appreciate that. And I also want to recognize that the CWCB staff does historically and traditionally operate in that manner. And it's fantastic to see that. And I think we do our best work as a state when we do that. I have been asked by my board to ask my board, when I talk about my board, the Colorado River District Board, to ask the CWCB board to try to understand. They were perplexed by the confidentiality agreement, and they appreciate the revisions that have occurred so far to that agreement, and they appreciate the effort made. But there are still, as a public body, we have, at our request, the CWCB staff has been kind enough to put several of our employees, myself included, on those working groups. But we're concerned by the limitations there, that we'll be unable to come back and talk about matters with our board that are not appropriate for executive session. So they're not legal advice matters, and they're not personnel matters, and they're not negotiation matters. They're public policy matters. And our board views those work groups as the foundation for the public policy, much the way Mr. Trampy, who happens to be on my board, but hears from his own constituents at the Gunnison Cattlemen's Association, and I've gotten many earfuls from our agricultural users throughout our basin. They want a process. I mean, what I would like, and what our board would like, is a process that our water users in the state, throughout the state, can get behind and trust and understand. We're concerned that kicking it off with a tight confidentiality agreement may send the wrong message, and that's what our water users have told us at this point. And I will be clear, not me and not our board, we're not inferring any kind of nefarious intent on the staff, or any inappropriate desire to control the process, or to have a predetermined outcome. It is not that. It is about how you create an inclusive and public process. And I think this board and this staff has done that so well in the past, that this confidentiality agreement really hit us as a surprise. And I've had lots of very, very professional conversations with Director Mitchell, and I appreciate her time on that. But my board did ask for some insight from this board, the CWCB board members, to be able to understand why that process should be governed in that way. And we've talked a lot about the technical details. And yes, to the extent that there are those few documents that may be given to a few of those committees that are, may impact the state's interstate negotiations, those understandably should be held confidential. To the extent that we don't want attribution to individuals or to organizations during those free-ranging ideas, that's an easy thing to handle through a non-attribution agreement. But it's that limitation on the discussion of what was talked about and being able to talk to our water users about it that is so frustrating to our board. And so I was charged with being able to bring this back to my board and try to explain it to them. And I would love some insight from the CWCB board members to allow me to do that if I can.
Andy, thanks for bringing this forward. And I think that it's our function to constantly be available to hear from members of the public. And so I appreciate you and Bill and everyone else who's reached out to different board members and staff getting in touch with us, because the staff does I think always operate with transparency and integrity. And Brent and Karen have made it pretty clear that they'll show up anywhere they're invited, and sometimes they show up where they're not invited. And so I want to recognize that given the feedback that the staff received, it went from a confidentiality agreement, it changed to a disclosure agreement. And I think that the process continues to evolve. And the board is discussing with staff how that evolves and how we can get to the place, which I think you just described, where we can have meaningful conversations and people are comfortable. And so I think we all have a lot more in common on this issue than we do differences. And I would ask that everyone continue to engage in a productive manner so that we can get to a place where these groups can have these meaningful conversations and not be caught up by, potential discourse and disagreements. So thanks for sharing, and please continue to be open and work well with our staff. Director Brody, did you want to add something?
I think you've covered it. Thank you.
Any other board members want to provide feedback to Andy? Okay. Sean.
Andy, could I ask, given the existing language in the document, is your board willing to allow staff to sign on to that and participate?
They actually, oddly enough, or in the process of setting a special meeting for me to be able to report back what the logic behind the CWCB's board's presentation or discussion with this confidentiality portion was. And so they were unwilling to allow us, our staff recommendation was, we weren't crazy about it, but please let us participate. And they said, we're not really comfortable with letting you do that right now. We need to hear why the CWCB board wants that limitation on the ability to talk in a public meeting about these ideas, not about who says what or how, but the ideas that are being discussed in these work groups. And Heather, with all due respect, I appreciate your response, but it was not really responsive to what my board has asked. And so if anybody on the board wants to share that, whether it's at a public meeting or in a conversation, I'm fine with that. I don't really have anything to bring back to my board right now. And so I think that we're in a bit of a bind, because we really would like to participate in a very productive manner in those work groups. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to do so at this point.
Director Brody?
So just a point of order. I think Andy brings up some important questions and concerns, but I'm a little bit concerned that we don't have the staff members here, the representatives from the Attorney General's office, who are probably best positioned to help provide some of the feedback that he may be looking for. This is also not an item that is on our agenda at this point. So I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time, the appropriate form to continue the conversation on this topic.
Steve?
I better put my Southwest interim executive director hat on for a minute. Our board met in June and found the original one was unacceptable, and they would not let any of the employees participate. They have not met on the new version, which their next board meeting is August 6th. And there are still, myself and the attorney have discussed the latest version, and we still have some concerns on the non-public. Everything has to be non-public, as opposed to, and if you wanted to have it in the to be if it's not non-public, we have to request permission from the CWCB or somehow make an arrangement with CWCB. If you could, my suggestion would be just to reverse that. And it's somewhat like what Andy said. If there's a way to say, here's some information that should not be public, let us know that. But the rest of the discussions with non-attribute and all that sort of thing would be okay to go ahead. I think maybe there's a good chance that might be modified some more in the next weeks. And I got 2 weeks before our next board meeting. And if you could soften it a little bit more, I think that would be, we'd like that.
Thanks for the feedback, Steve. And I think, as I said, this is kind of an evolving matter. Director Brody? Director Brown?
Yes, I think maybe to say it another way, we're not giving you a non-answer. We just need a little time to get back to you. We recognize and we hear the feedback, and unfortunately, we don't have the space to be able to react to you right now. So please be patient with us and know that we've heard you loud and clear from other constituents as well, and you will receive feedback on this.
Lisa? Oh, Lisa wanted to weigh in.
That's okay. No, I just was curious. I just wanted a clarification. The expectation is that the document as it's currently drafted and has been circulated, what's the timeline on expectation? Because I know we're trying to set these meetings fairly quickly, and I just am wondering, and I'm very respectful of what Jackie has just said, I just want to make sure that we're not getting ahead of ourselves and having meetings where there may not be that resolution.
I think, can I say something? Thank you. So I think it's important as we move forward to recognize this is we're developing the process at this point. And so we have about a year to do this based on the work plan. And so there is some level of time urgency that we would like to get started on this. I think it's better for us to be planning while it is raining and the rivers are flowing at a high level, at a level that we haven't been used to for the last 19 years. I would rather talk about this now because I think that people are not coming in at a desperate place at the second. And so I want to move forward on this, and we will be making some decisions. I think the boards, or I think the work groups are in the scheduling process at this point. I don't believe that anything in those first meetings will be discussed that will be heavily reliant on the consent of these agreements. So, but I do need a little more time after hearing from staff today and from the board to make decisions on exactly how to move forward. I'm assuming that will occur before the first work group, and I will be in constant communication with everyone that I've heard from, but also those that I have not heard from, and that I want to hear from. And so as we move forward with this, it is our intention and has always been our intention to have the most inclusive process that we can. And we did that with the water plan. We did that with the technical update to Colorado's water plan. But we also at the same time want people to be able to have open discussion. So how do we strike that balance? And I'm getting as much advice as I can on this point and the best way to do that. So I think I'm asking you to trust not only me, but the entire board that we're moving forward in a way that we think is the best for the state. And I know that's a lot to ask, and I don't ask that lightly. But I hear you.
Director Trick?
Just to address Lisa's point on timing here, I think if anybody's participation in the first meeting of the work group is contingent on resolving this, that I myself, and I can't speak for the board members right now, but I'm sure we can commit to having a meeting called before that time, a phone meeting or something like that, in order to have a formal decision made on this if that's necessary. So.
Is there any additional discussion? Oh, Paul. Oh, sorry. I'm the wrong Heather. I don't know how the cards work. Paul.
No, it's good. Just I want to say thanks to everyone's time today. I'm a glass half full kind of person, and maybe wanted to make some comments here towards the end of the day. Director George and many of you in the room have inspired me over time. I live on the banks of the Colorado River, and all aspects of my livelihood depend on it. And I think that somewhere in this journey of demand management over time, there seems to be some negativity brought up every now and then. Words like burden and other things are used. And I understand there's many different paths that this can go and that we're in a feasibility stage. But when I look at it, if we can hit a sweet spot with funding, and if we have sustainable funding, and if we have equitable distribution on this, in the meanwhile, we'll be teaching a culture of people in the state that water conservation is not necessarily a bad thing, but actually a really good thing. And if we're doing that in all ways that speak to the water plan and sustainability, then I say we win. And I think that this is the right environment to grow this from. But I would encourage maybe to consider a little bit more positive attitude right now in the investigation stage, in the feasibility stage. I used the wrong word, sorry. So that as we're talking about it with people in the roundtables and others, that we have the chance to set the stage for it to be really a great thing for the state. Let's go win.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. Okay. Any final parting words? I see no cards up. Okay. Does anyone want a motion to adjourn? Director Yon.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
I looked for you.
It's kind of a.
It's been moved by Director Yon and seconded by Director Brown to adjourn the meeting. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we shall proceed to vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, motion carries. See you guys in September.